Hello, thank you for watching this recording of Grasslands, our least known and most threatened ecosystem, a talk presented by Beth Madden at the Bozeman Public Library on February 12th, 2025. This talk is the second in our series of wild talks leading up to our 2025 Earth Day Festival. This year's theme is Living with the Land, and we have an exciting lineup of wild talks through April that covers wetlands, grasslands, regenerative agriculture, and saving wildlife from urban sprawl. To watch a recording of a previous event or to register for an upcoming event, visit our website at www.gallatinvalleyearthday.org. Before we get to the talk, I wanted to thank our sponsors. Our whole series of talks is free because of the generous support from businesses and organizations in our community. I'd like to thank our fiscal sponsor, Greater Gallatin United Way, our premier sponsors for our whole 2025 series, Yellowstonian, a new online publication that you should check out, and VW of Bozeman. Our benefactor sponsors, Bozeman Greenbuild and local radio station KGVM, and our stewards and supporting sponsors, Gallatin Wildlife Association, Sacagawea Audubon Society, Bridger Bowl Ski Area, and Montana Parent Magazine. And last but not least, thanks to all of our community volunteers who make these events happen. Now on to tonight's talk. Beth Madden is a wildlife biologist with more than 30 years of experience, mostly as a federal biologist in Montana and North Dakota with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. She has an MS in biology from MSU, where her research focused on relationships between prairie birds and fire ecology. Her subsequent work on national wildlife refuges involved managing and monitoring grassland habitats and wildlife. In retirement, she enjoys engaging others in discovering our natural world. And now, here's Beth's talk.
Thanks, Rich. And hi, everyone. It's great to be here. And thank you for your interest in grasslands. It's really heartening to see so many people here, and there's more online. We've got a great plan for this evening. I've got about 45 minutes, so I'm really going to clip right along. I'll start out with some of the basics, and then cover some culture and history. And then there's a big section on prairie ecology, which is my favorite part. Then we'll have time to cover some conservation efforts on the prairies and tips on visiting the prairies, and hopefully ample time for questions and answers at the end. So we've got about 8 to 12 major biomes in the world, depending on how you classify them. And they're also called life zones. And these are regions of the earth that have a certain climate, and so they share similar patterns of flora and fauna. And you can see here that biomes fall out along the bottom on a gradient from wet to dry, and up the left side there from hot to cold. And basically, grasslands are areas that are too wet to be desert and too dry to be forests. So grasslands gain dominance. Grasslands make up about 1/3 of the Earth's terrestrial surface. They're on every continent but Antarctica. And this map splits out temperate grasslands in green and other grasslands in purple. And you can see the major temperate grasslands are in southern South America, South Africa, and the former Soviet Union, and over to Northern Europe. And then, of course, the plains and prairies of Central North America. Temperate grasslands are one of the most altered terrestrial ecosystems in the world and are recognized as having the lowest level of protection of the world's biomes. And this is a quote from a peer-reviewed research paper in the journal Ecology Letters. So how did they come up with this? Well, here's how they measured it. And down the center here are the biomes, and I know you can't read them, but what they did is they looked at the amount of the habitat converted over on the left compared with the amount of that habitat protected on the right. And you can see temperate grasslands are at the very top of that list. In the US especially, we never really included our grasslands when we developed our land preservation programs in the 20th century. They just really weren't valued as an ecosystem. You can compare that. Down at the bottom are the temperate conifer forests, and they have the smallest amount converted and the highest amount protected. So here in the American West, especially, we've done a really good job of protecting our forests relative to other habitats. Okay, well, tonight I'm going to focus on our Great Plains grasslands, which are shown here in green. That looks great, I guess, but there's just a big swath through the center of North America, going all the way down into Mexico and up into the Canadian provinces. And within the Great Plains, more specifically, we can see our position here in Montana in an area defined as the Northern Great Plains. And this region has been receiving a lot of focus because it's the area with the most intact prairie still remaining. So it holds the most promise for large-scale conservation. So a little bit about the attitudes and cultures of the prairies. I think it's safe to say that they seem to have kind of an image problem. One of the most positive things you might hear is about the breadbasket and the heartland of the country, kind of a rural nostalgia for the farming lifestyle. But in general, though, I would say prairies today tend to be underappreciated, misunderstood, and sometimes maligned. We have an American attitude that the absence of trees is an absence of value. And you'll hear that term flyover country, that it's a place to be avoided when going from coast to coast. So overall, there's a real lack of familiarity, and we can explore some of the reasons for this tonight, and we'll start out by taking a look at some of the history. So let's paint a picture of this ecosystem since the most recent ice age, which was a little over 10,000 years ago. Here's one that Carl Bodmer painted in 1833. So there have been people living here for thousands of years. And we have one of the greatest concentrations of wildlife on the planet in this region. All the journals and writings from the early explorers reflect the same thing. There's a land of plenty. And they would send these rave reviews back, likening it to the plains of Africa with these great concentrations of animals and American Serengeti. So here's another one of Carl Bodmer's scenes along the Missouri. And right after Bodmer, John James Audubon came up the Missouri River, and he spent the summer of 1843 at Fort Union on the North Dakota, Montana border. Are you having trouble hearing? Oh, how is the sound, you guys? Good. Great. Okay. Great. So Audubon came and he, reported in the same thing. He described, wrote letters home about the great assemblages of animals. And he said, in fact, it's impossible to describe or even conceive the vast multitudes of these animals that exist even now and feed on these ocean-like prairies. And during that summer, Audubon was working on his Quadrupeds of North America, which was his mammal work to accompany his bird work. And here is his wolf, swift fox, and grizzly bear. And these were all historically very common prairie animals. Here in red, we see the original range of bison. They're very widespread, going all the way back east there. And it's estimated that before 1800, there were at least 30 million bison roaming North America. Some estimates are as high as 60 million. And then this was along with about 15 to 25 million pronghorn. Also, elk and deer were widespread all across the area, along with their predators, wolves and grizzly bears. And on top of that, there were about 3 to 5 billion prairie dogs. And And then we have the humans living here, the Plains Indian peoples, and tens of thousands of years of experience here. They know how to make a good living on these lands. At that time, they were mostly nomadic, along with the nomadic movements of the buffalo. And they were also moving around and utilizing the vast plant resources of the prairies. Here's a photo of a Lakota woman with a harvest of prairie turnip or timsala in their language. It's also called Indian bredra, and this was one of the most important plant foods for them, and they would move around just to harvest it because it has this really nice starchy root that they could store for the winters. European conquest. This is a story that isn't new to any of us, but it's really important. We had these new governments asserting land claims and removing and confining the native peoples in an almost complete decimation of the cultures. Then at the same time, they exterminated the animals, and that's really hard to exaggerate too. We saw the extinctions and extirpations of most of those prairie large animals on the prairies, the plains wolves, plains grizzly bears, plains bighorn sheep, the plains elk, swift fox. And unbelievably, as most of you know the story, by 1884, those 30 million bison were down to 325 bison left nationwide. 95% of the pronghorn were gone. So then as we're clearing all the people and animals off of the Great Plains, in the late 1800s, we had this wave of European immigrants. The homesteaders moved in, and they began converting the prairie sod to cropland. And here's how that looked in the late 1800s. Painting by Harvey Dunn. Buffalo bones are plowed under. The turning over of the prairie sod for farming. And it was a really successful campaign, starting in the east and spreading west. And they converted the prairie to cropland as fast as they could. So to summarize, we had what some people refer to as a double dismantling of our prairies. We had the near elimination of the Great Plains animals and people, followed by settlement with the mass conversion of the prairie sod to agriculture. And the result is an intensely altered ecosystem. Yes, there's still prairie out there in the patchwork of the Great Plains, but it's so fragmented, and with the loss of most of the animals, it's essentially not really a functioning ecosystem anymore in most places. And this is what much of today's prairies are like. A familiar scene, we've got a monoculture of annual crops, corn and soybeans and wheat and other grains. This big patchwork of agricultural lands, and it's largely devoid of native prairie plants and animals. And you can see why we might feel disconnected from it, and why it might be considered flyover country. It's now really far removed from that American Serengeti from just a couple hundred years ago. And the conversion of our grasslands to agriculture is ongoing. This is a really striking photo by Chris Boyer showing some plow up of prairie in northeast Montana. During the decade from 09 to 2018, more than 59 million acres of intact grasslands were converted to cropland in the Great Plains. And then we're averaging almost 2 million more acres each year. And these are data from the World Wildlife Fund's Plow Print project, which we'll talk about later. But the point is, grassland conversion is not a historic thing. It's happening now at a really alarming rate. So why does this matter? And why do the prairies matter? Well, here's one really cute reason of pronghorn fawn. But now we'll get into the ecology of part of the program, and hopefully you'll understand more about why this whole system is important. Okay, some basics. Prairies, a diverse ecological community dominated by native grasses and wildflowers. A few trees and shrubs may be present. And this word prairie first entered the English language in the 1680s when the French fur traders first began crossing North America, and it's from the Latin and French for meadow. Most people use the terms prairie and grassland interchangeably today. You'll hear me using both of them. And then the term native prairie refers to prairies that have survived without being plowed under for agriculture. And prairies that have been reseeded on land that was formerly farmed or otherwise degraded, we call those restored prairies. We often split the prairies into three types based on the dominant grasses found there. And you can see here we've got the tall, mixed, and shortgrass prairies, starting in the east and heading west. And really, this is a gradient or a progression of decreasing. It's a progression from tall, dense grasses to short, sparse grasses, and then a gradient of decreasing moisture as you move from east to west across the Great Plains. So there aren't any hard boundaries here. And many maps will show Montana as shortgrass prairie. And here's another variation of this kind of a map. This one's from National Audubon, and that includes all of Montana as shortgrass prairie. So just a different interpretation, but it's just really important to understand that gradient and moisture, vegetation and moisture. That is what's important to understand as you move from east to west. So those tall grass prairies covered the eastern third of the Great Plains. These are the dominant grasses there: big bluestem, little bluestem, switchgrass, and Indian grass with a nice diversity of wildflowers. And these grasses grow 6 to 9 feet tall. They're really amazing if you've ever been around them. The settlers would have stories of getting lost. You've probably read some of those stories. They're really, really spectacular. Rich soils and adequate rainfall make it perfect for row cropping. And as a result, the amount remaining of the tallgrass prairies is less than 4%. Some say less than 1%. So we've had a nearly complete loss of the tallgrass prairies, and many consider it to be functionally extinct. Okay, let's skip out west to the western edge of the Great Plains to the shortgrass prairies along the Rocky Mountains. And here there's the least amount of precipitation defined by really low stature grasses. They might only be ankle high in some places. We've got species like blue grama, buffalo grass, June grass, some of the common species. Being so arid, it's best suited for grazing. But now with more irrigation and drought tolerant crops, it's increasingly more threatened by agriculture. And amount remaining is somewhere around 30 or 40%. Okay, that center third of the Great Plains, so we've got the mixed grass prairie. And this prairie is really diverse. It's got a mix of all those tall grass prairie plants and shortgrass prairie plants kind of all co-occurring. And we've got grasses like needle grasses, blue grama, wheatgrass, and a lot of wildflowers and shrubs. And it might be maybe knee-high grasses in general, depending on the moisture in a given year. And we estimate that less than 30% of it remains today. So a quick summary of the flora. Overall, there's more than 3,000 plant species in the Great Plains. And we've got grasses contributing the most biomass. And then wildflowers or forbs have the greatest number of species. And there's also some shrubs. You might have scattered low shrubs like snowberry, and then even a few taller shrubs like chokecherry making it in some areas. And there are a few trees, some drought tolerant species that have figured out how to make it in some areas out there. And prairies gain their resiliency by having this huge diversity of species. And there's a nice sports metaphor to say they have a deep bench, so they can handle whatever the climate throws at them by having a great diversity of species. on the bench. And just to highlight that, I'm gonna ask you to ponder how many species of native grasses do you guys think are found in Montana? You can just go ahead and call out your guesses. Any guesses? How many? 1,000, okay. Anybody else? 200. 200. 100. 100. 35. 35. Right. Well, in Montana, we've got 158 species, so I don't know who won, but again, give them three classes.
What do I get?
Satisfaction.
Be worth it.
All right. So if you take home one message about prairie from this talk, here it is. It's all happening underground. And this is what people tend to be the least aware of. So most prairie plants are perennials, and the above ground parts die back each fall. But the plant itself is still alive, and that growing point is at the soil. It's really, really important. And here's a photographic look at roots, and we can see here the contrast. On the left side, we've got perennial prairie grasses, and growing next to it is a wheat crop, an annual wheat crop. And you can see there's very little going on under the wheat field there in the soil. And these images are from a neat project called The Secret Life of Roots from the Land Institute in Kansas. And this is a term often applied to the prairies, the underground forest. And the Flint Hills Discovery Center in Kansas created this exhibit to help people get down there and understand the system better and actually see what's going on. Here's part of the Prairie Roots Project that's developed for schools by the Tallgrass Prairie Center. And this is an actual big blue stem plant with its root system. And the Prairie Center grows these out and gives them to the schools along with a lesson plan. So approximately 70% of the average prairie plant is roots. And then each year, about 1/3 of those roots of the prairie grasses die at the end of the growing season. And so those dead roots are down there decaying into organic matter in the soil. And then living in there is this tremendous community of microorganisms, trillions and trillions of microorganisms. There's bacteria and mycorrhizal fungus and springtails, water bears, nematodes. It's a whole ecosystem. There's herbivores and predators eating the herbivores, and there's scavengers, and they're all fostering that decomposition and nutrient cycling down in this underground forest. And there's all sorts of bigger things, like ants and pocket gophers and dung beetles and beetle grubs that are living down there too. Another important point about prairie ecology, it's a system that thrives on disturbances. So prairies are created and maintained by climate, fire, and grazing. So fire and climate are what keeps trees from taking over. And then fire and grazing interact to create and maintain that diverse plant community. And without these processes, you're not going to have prairies. They'll turn into unhealthy grasslands or progress into shrublands or woodlands. A little bit about the climate. The Great Plains have cold winters and hot summers. And then the thing about the prairie climate is an average year almost never happens. There's extreme variability in rainfall and temperatures, especially with moisture. There's a cycling of wet years and dry years. And these periods of drought are not an aberration. They're part of the norm. And drought is what facilitates the important process of fire. And so the plants and animals that live there are adapted to this, and they all have strategies to survive and thrive among all these extremes. So this is a snapshot of drought conditions on a given day, just to show you the patchiness of how drought occurs. And you can see eastern Montana in July 2017 was in extreme drought. And sure enough, we had wildfires out there, more than 250,000 acres burned in eastern Montana. And it was all part of the natural disturbance process. It was, you know, it's a tragedy for people that have private property and infrastructure. And then the next winter, 2018, we had all this snow, we had a really wet spring and summer, and there was a whole different set of conditions up here in the next summer. I do want to point out that these patterns are all really intensifying with climate change, and that's absolutely, that's a whole other story about the future of our planet. But do know that drought is a very natural ecological pattern that has a role in grasslands. A little bit about fire's role. The prairie plants die back after each growing season, and then you get this thatch of dead vegetation that builds up. And most of the nutrients are locked up in those dead plants that are yet to decay. But the prairies are too arid for much decay and decomposition. It can take years for blades of grass to decay. So fire is what serves as the mechanism to clear off all the dead plant litter and cycle the nutrients back into the prairie. The plants are not killed. Remember that their growing points are at or below the soil level. And lightning is the main generator of prairie fires, but they were also commonly set by humans historically. Before European settlement, they were always widespread and common and not a tragedy. And George Catlin sketched this scene when he came up the Missouri River in 1832, and he wrote about it in his journal. The prairies burning form some of the most beautiful scenes that are to be witnessed in this country. Every acre of these vast prairies being covered for hundreds of miles with a crop of grass, which dies and dries in the fall, burns over during the fall or early in the spring. So again, just reinforcing that fire is a natural ecological force here. What about grazing or herbivory? Well, our grazers and our grasslands are co-evolved. They need each other. They've got it worked out. Grazing affects energy flow, nutrient cycling, and the plant community composition of the prairies. And we've got all these critters that are grazing above ground and eating all those leaves and stems like bison and things like grasshoppers and prairie dogs, and now cattle as well. But don't forget about these important underground grazers, things like nematodes and pocket gophers that are eating all those roots and root hairs down there. And then there's super important relationships between fire and grazing, interactions that we don't really have time to get into, but know that they really work together. Importantly, things like nutrient cycling in all sorts of ways. So since settlement, the system's gotten pretty out of whack. We suppress most of the fires if we can. Grazing is much more static. We have a lot of fences. We've got exotic plant invasions. So our remaining grasslands are often quite unhealthy. But luckily, our prairie management has been progressing to incorporate and mimic some of the natural processes. So many folks are now using more regenerative grazing strategies, for example, and ending up with healthier grasslands and often getting better yields from their livestock through these systems as well. Another reason the prairies matter, and it's a big one, is what prairies do for us, the ecosystem services they provide. So these are benefits delivered by grasslands through ecological processes that are largely taken for granted. We don't tend to factor them into our economies. And they're really critical things like generating soils, renewing soil fertility, protecting soils and watersheds from erosion, mitigating floods and drought, and pollination. Pollination of crops and plants. If you think about it, pollination is a service for which there's no technological substitute. And perhaps the greatest ecosystem service from prairies is carbon storage in that underground forest. Grasslands store carbon and really contribute to climate stability in a really big way. And here's some numbers on carbon storage. You can see grasslands store more than a third of our carbon globally. And importantly, grasslands store their carbon underground, so it's much more reliable, safer than forests. With the grasslands burn, like we talked about, most of that carbon remains underground, so it's protected. When forests burn, all of the carbon from the trees is going up into the atmosphere. Here's many reasons that the prairies matter, our prairie animals, and I know this is a favorite part for a lot of people, and I actually have a 2-hour program just about the prairie animals, but I'm happily, I have to totally shortchange all these cool critters for the sake of time tonight. So I'm not going to talk about bison and prairie dogs and how as keystone species, they provide habitat for a whole bunch of other species. I'm not going to talk about black-hooded ferrets and swift fox, which squeaked by extinction, and now we've got a few good programs that are showing some success with reintroducing them. I'm not going to talk about the great strategies that reptiles and amphibians have developed for thriving in prairie environments. Worst of all, I'm not going to talk about pronghorn, which is the iconic and really cool prairie animal. But then there's the prairie birds, and I am going to spend just a minute or two on prairie birds because I can't help myself. Just briefly, here's a thunderstorm map of grassland bird distributions, and there's a list of the major species down on the left, and you can just see the northern Great Plains has the highest richness or the highest number of grassland bird species occurring in North America. It's really, really striking. We're really ground zero for grassland birds. But declines in grassland birds have been the steepest and most consistent of any group of North American birds. And we've been aware of this for some time now, and it's pretty alarming. If you look at the bottom of the habitats chart here, we can see the very bottom are grassland birds, and it's showing the change since 1970. We've lost more than 53% of our grassland birds since 1970. And more than 74% of the species are showing negative trends. And these data are mostly from the Breeding Bird Survey, and recently there's been a lot of media attention to a paper that was in Science by Rosenberg et al. And it describes the staggering loss of 3 billion birds in North America since 1970. And there's even a website, 3billionbirds.org. You can look that up. It's a pretty sobering story. And here's how these losses look on a species by species basis. These are graphs of 4 prairie birds for which Montana provides really important breeding habitat. And you can see we've lost more than 80% of the global population of each of these species. And so just really alarming losses, and largely due to the great habitat loss that I was telling you about. So it's not looking good for many of our grassland birds. All right, well then let's talk about conservation. There is a lot of great momentum toward reclaiming and restoring the prairies now. Right here in North America is one of the world's most threatened natural systems. The Northern Great Plains is as important as the Amazon or Arctic and deserves our attention. And that's a quote from Martha Kaufman, who heads up the Northern Great Plains program of the World Wildlife Fund. And they're headquartered right here in Bozeman and doing comprehensive work in prairie conservation. So we mentioned earlier, the number one issue in prairie conservation is conversion to agriculture. And now that you understand more about all that's going on underground in the prairie, you can maybe better understand what a loss is occurring with grassland plow up. And you might even ask, why haven't anyone plow up grasslands, you know, in this day and age? But there's actually plenty of reasons. If you're trying to make a living in agriculture, the crop prices have been really high in recent years. There's a lot of money to be made with biofuels. We've got more northern adapted and drought tolerant crop varieties. There's better irrigation in some areas. And we've got to remember that our ag producers want to make the best living they can on their land. So this is a graphic from the World Wildlife Fund's plow print project that I mentioned earlier. And this one's from 2017. They do them every year and they're all online. I encourage you to look them up. So the way the plow print works, the brown and the orange areas are the plow print of all the areas in cropland. And the green areas are intact grasslands. And you can see in the Northern Great Plains area, which is outlined in yellow, you can see the large areas of green intact grasslands in Montana and South Dakota and also the Sandhills in Nebraska. Really bright spots. So there's a lot of promise and hope for conservation here. And there's so much going on. I'm gonna really just barely be able to scratch the surface. But first of all, our tribal nations, not just in Montana, but all around the country. I mean, they had a complete upheaval of their civilization, but they're still here. They're very interested in conservation and especially in restoring their connections with bison. Got a big movement in regenerative grazing and agriculture. Protected areas. We talked about how we mostly left the prairies out when we protected lands, but we do have some protected areas. And so these are areas that are managed with biodiversity and natural processes and wildlife taking center stage. And then there's the Farm Bill. The Farm Bill is the largest source of private lands conservation funding we have. They have a bunch of programs geared toward building resilient agricultural systems and helping keep natural systems intact. And these conservation programs are only a very small part of the Farm Bill, but they're super important for grasslands. And I do have to say, our Farm Bill expired in 2023 and we're getting along on continuing resolution. So I don't know what the future is there, of course. And then I also like to think about how we as consumers have a role in voting with our pocketbooks, as they say. So we're involved too. So our tribal nations, their relationship with buffalo was completely severed with European colonization, but now there's a comeback happening. So this Intertribal Buffalo Council is made up of 69 tribes working together to restore bison to their cultures. All of our Montana tribes are members of this, and all 7 of our Montana reservations now have bison back, at least to some degree. And there's a lot of great stuff going on there. Also, there's the Buffalo Nations Grassland Alliance. And this is a nonprofit, and they're working to ensure that the Native nations in the Northern Great Plains have the technical and financial resources to plan and act on their visions for their traditional lands and water. And that includes especially grasslands and native wildlife, that they're supported and that tribal members can thrive by connecting with them again. One good thing that's been happening here in Montana is swiftfox and black-footed ferret reintroductions on some of our Indian reservations. Okay, it turns out for prairie conservation in the private landscape, excuse me, one of the best things we can do is promote ranching and sustainable grazing practices. If we can support ranchers on the landscape, it helps them stay in grass and avoid plowing up their prairie for crops like corn and wheat. So if beef is the crop, then we can keep those grasslands intact so they can provide all those important grassland ecosystem services we were talking about. And of course, remember that most of our prairies are on private land and people need to make a living on them. So all of these groups and many more are doing conservation work on private lands in what we call the working landscape. And these groups work with ag producers on things like improved grazing systems, maybe with funding for fencing and water structures, or reseeding grasslands. They might help with marketing beef. There's just a really wide array of projects. And a great place to learn more about these working landscape efforts is in this award-winning film from the Life in the Land series. I hope some of you have caught this. It's a free online, it's a 39-minute video called Central Montana Plains. They actually have about 6 videos they produced, but this is just, it's like taking a field trip out to that region. It has gorgeous cinematography. So lifeintheland.org, the Central Montana Plains. Okay, then we have lands where biodiversity and natural processes are the main focus, are protected areas. And so one example of protected areas is our national wildlife refuges, and they're administered by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and they have a wildlife first mission. And many of our wildlife refuges, unfortunately, are pretty small. But here in Montana, we do have the Charles M. Russell National Wildlife Refuge, which is about 1 million acres, which is a really nice, nice chunk of land. And then we have American Prairie, which is a nonprofit that is creating a large protected area in north central Montana. And they have a really ambitious plan, and they're linking with existing blocks of protected private lands in that Charles M. Russell Refuge and Missouri Breaks area. And they're assembling a multi-million acre nature reserve that conserves the species-rich grasslands of Montana's legendary Great Plains for the enjoyment of future generations. And here's where this is. You can see north central Montana, you can see the Missouri River going through there. Again, American Prairie is a nonprofit, and since 2004, they've been purchasing lands that go on the market and then growing out this protected area. And this map's a little bit outdated. The blue properties there are some of the lands that are have been added to the reserve. But they strategically chose this area in north central Montana to focus on because it's one of the best places where we can try and achieve a fully functioning prairie ecosystem. And luckily, I don't have to say anything more about American Prairie because Gallatin Valley Earth Day is going to give you a chance to hear from them directly on February 27th. And you can zoom in and watch Daniel Kinka's program here about American Prairie. So I talked about these two models for delivering conservation, working landscapes and protected areas. And then people will often ask, well, which is the best way to go? And there's sometimes controversy about which is the best route to take. And it's really not that one of these models is better than the other. Both are required in order to restore the prairie ecosystem. This is a really important point. Saving this ecosystem is going to be a really tough road to hoe, and it's going to take both large protected areas where all the native species can flourish and a conservation friendly private landscape in the surrounding areas. So it's not either or. We need both of these models. And I'm happy to say that we're currently achieving great grassland conservation in Montana using both of these models. So it's hard to appreciate this ecosystem if you don't have any experience in it. And that's why they set up the Great Plains Ecotourism Coalition. You can visit, their website is visittheprairie.com. And they will help you find places all over the Great Plains, depending on your interests. They have stargazing and fossil hunting and crane viewing, and they really have something for everyone. And they have these and a bunch more of really neat posters and postcards that you can buy on their website. What about visiting our grasslands in Montana? It isn't always obvious where you can go. A lot of them are in private ownership, and there aren't always many services out there. So I wanted to share a few tips with you. For starters, I definitely recommend visiting some of our national wildlife refuges. Some of them have some really nice chunks of prairie. They usually also have some nice wetlands too. And many of them are well set up for visitors. And I've particularly circled here Benton Lake up by Great Falls, Charles M. Russell Refuge, and then Bedoin up near Malta and Medicine Lake. And each of these four has a tour route for the public and visitor services. So you can go to their websites and get more information about visiting there. Some other great prairie spots to visit. Right across the Montana border into Saskatchewan is Grasslands National Park, Canadian, set up really well for visitors. I highly recommend a visit there if you have the chance. It's really, really great setup for public use. Then we've got the Bitter Creek Wilderness Study Area, which is mostly BLM land up near Glasgow and North Valley County. And that's much more remote. There's very few services, but some really amazing prairie if you're looking for that. Then American Prairie in north central Montana near Lewistown and Malta, they have a lot of visitor opportunities. Many of their lands are open to public use, and they built up some really nice infrastructure, a couple of campgrounds and rental cabins, and they have a nice visitor services section on their website. Also, I wanted to mention our state lands. Montana has more than 5 million acres of state trust lands. And some of them are marked with these little blue signs, but not all of them. And there's a lot of native prairie. If you're a bird hunter, you know about state lands. You do need a Montana conservation license to use our state lands. And that includes Mount Ellis for everybody that likes on the state land. And so, but you just go on the FWP website, it's like $8 or $10 for a conservation tag. So, yeah. All right, so many of these places are remote, they're kind of far away. And I want to encourage you to go out there and stay in some of these small towns like Glasgow or Malta or Roundup, and give it some time out there and get to know the area. It's hard to just go driving out there and access things. And it also gets really windy out there. You better factor that in because that's not good. So you want to use your early mornings and evenings, and you want to plan an extra day. If it's really windy, don't fight the wind. Go into town and check out the museum, or just do some planning and take a little bit of time, and you're really in for some amazing treats out there. Okay, so in closing, I hope you have a better understanding of the prairies now, how so much of it is underground, how altered the ecosystem has been. Hopefully you have a feel for what a great natural resource it is still, and all the good work that's going on to maintain it. So I want to leave you with a quote that I feel sums up the contradictions and complexities of the prairies. And this is from William Lee Skeetmoon in his book, Prairie Earth. I came to understand that the prairies are nothing but grass, as the sea is nothing but water. The prairie is not a topography that shows its all, but rather a vastly exposed place of concealment, where the splendid lies within the plain cover. Thank you. Questions and discussion. Anybody who's online, you can type in questions, and Rich will be fielding those. And then here in the room, Barb Finney will be wandering with the microphone, and you can shout out your question that way. So, here, we got a question right here.
Can you recommend an app that we can, go out with our cell phone and look at a piece of grass and say, what is that?
Ah. Well, there are getting to be, the question was, is there an app that we could go out and figure out a grass or, and there's number one, there is a great Montana grasses app that, Matt Lavin, our very own Bozeman's own Matt Lavin produced. And that it's not gonna just shout out the answer of the grass. You have to put a little work into it, but it includes all the grasses and you can put in some of the characteristics and it'll narrow down and it'll help you toward it. So that's one thing, is Montana Grasses app.
Can you take a picture of it?
You can't with that app, but then there are like Seek, SEEK is one app, and there's a lot of apps now for floral identification. I'll tell you what, it's gonna be tougher with grasses though, because you'd have to get a really good photo of a grass. But it does work on some grasses.
You have a personal favorite on for grasses?
Well, I took Matt Lavin's agricology class back in graduate school, and it blew my mind just to learn about all the grasses, and I learned them that way. So, grasses are really tricky, and that's you're like, there's 158 grasses. You kind of can't believe that because they kind of all look the same. But just one at a time. There's some of them are really outstanding and they really catch your attention, and you can figure them out. And field trips, we have a really active Montana Native Plant Society group around here, and we do field trips. But yeah, grasses are harder than your average plants to identify. Picture this. Does that work pretty well? Well, come on. Picture this is another app like Seek, and you can try it out. They're not 100%, so you'll get some misidentifications and things. And does anyone else have a favorite app that they love for flora?
Yeah, PlantNet.
PlantNet. Okay. Can you take a picture with that?
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
And I think you have to say whether it's a leaf or a flower, bark on the trees, or that sort of thing.
Yeah. Right.
But that was the guy from the Midwest.
If you're gonna talk anyone else.
I wanted to try to take up all the time. I'm using PlantNet, but I got that back in the Midwest, and I'm trying to learn about grasses in the Western Plains. So that's what I was looking for, some help.
Yeah, I thought PlantNet is all across the country.
Well, it might be, but I was up in Bridger and it stunk.
Oh.
So
Maybe you need to change your region or something. Anyway, yeah, good stuff though. It's fun figuring out those grasses.
All right, let me ask a question from online. Jean says, I watched another webinar that talked about cows decimating prairie soils in riparian areas. Is cattle ranching compatible with healthy grasslands?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I kind of alluded to that in the one slide about how with settlement, a lot of our grasslands have been thrown out of whack because we're either overgrazing them or undergrazing them. With fencing and so seems like we kind of learned the hard way. But the cattle, certainly, we need grazing out there. And so if nothing's going to be grazing there, it's great to put cattle out there, but you need to learn how and use some just proper techniques for grazing. But there's certainly, we've all seen areas that have been overgrazed, and there's also areas can be undergrazed, and all that the vegetation builds up. You get a lot of dead thatch out there. You can get weeds coming in, so you don't want too much or too little, and you want to look toward a lot of the new management is trying to mimic how the historic disturbance regimes worked and try to mimic that out.
what role does sagebrush play? Because it takes over so much, but it's part of grasslands.
Yeah, well, sagebrush, so the sagebrush steppe is another region out here, like in the Great Basin and some parts of Montana. And remember I was talking about, so the grasslands develop in this certain area of climate and fire and grazing. And the sagebrush steppe occurs in an area that's undergoing different climatic conditions. There might be snow at different times, or so it's, and some of it, Montana's kind of on the edge of the sagebrush steppe, but you know, like the Great Basin, Nevada, Utah, Oregon, there's a lot, the whole sagebrush steppe system is, it's an ecosystem just the way the Great Plains grasslands are an ecosystem. So, and there will be areas in Montana here, you'll kind of see some of them co-occur, and you think, oh, here's all the sagebrush, and then here's some prairie grasslands. But and the sagebrush steppe is a super threatened ecosystem as well, and has gone through a lot of conversion to agriculture and a lot of the disturbance regimes. But that's a whole other story. It's really interesting to learn about the sagebrush steppe. A different suite of animals, you know, sage grouse and different animals out there. So yeah, but that is a good question. And if if you're interested, you can Google sagebrush steppe and look at the maps of where that occurs, and then some of the characteristics of the climate.
Yeah, thanks. It's alarming that we're losing 2 million acres a year. But the area the size of Yellowstone Park every year. We're losing, and we're likely to lose more under the new administration as they move to do more oil and gas leasing in the prairie areas, especially in Montana. So if anybody wants to advocate for protecting prairie lands, then engage in some of those processes, because there will be public comment on it. The question though is what policy things are in place that are helping incentivize some of this plowing that's going on? I'm thinking about subsidy of corn, plowing for corn. And so what can we do to kind of try and slow that amount of plowing that's going on?
Yeah, there's a lot of incentive to grow crops. Biofuels are a really big one. So that's really driven a lot. In fact, on that plow print map that I showed, you could see South Dakota, a whole bunch of South Dakota had just in 2017, it was orange, and that prairie had just been turned over, and it coincided with a bunch of biofuel plants going online. So there are incentives, if you want to make money to crop it. But we are seeing a lot of great programs incentivizing and giving this recognition of, wow, grasslands have all these ecological ecosystem services, and they're storing carbon. So we are starting to, there's programs for carbon payments to have people keep grasslands and grass. And then there are a lot of programs through federal programs, and then also a lot of the nonprofits. I have all those logos up there of World Wildlife Funds and different groups that are helping. So maybe if someone has expiring CRP and they're thinking, oh, I guess we should put this back to cropland. If someone can say, hey, we can help you with fencing, we can put a water system in, you want to keep it as grassland. So there's those kind of incentives, and that whole working landscape thing. In fact, that film Life in the Land, that Central Montana film, they go out and you meet a lot of the people who are out there, and they're trying to make a living in the prairies, and you kind of see what they're up against. Lots of time.
Building on the way, got a question online about if someone owns grassland that might be a little bit degraded. Is there technical assistance or expertise they can get access to help them move into a more healthy system?
Yeah, all sorts of things. your local NRCS office, all the USDA offices, and yeah, equip. There's a lot of different programs and these nonprofits as well that we were mentioning. So there's a great deal of interest in it. It's kind of a heyday right now, I would say, for grassland conservation. People have realized, wow, this is really important. We gotta figure out a way to keep more grass on the landscape. So we really overlooked it. So yeah, but a lot of programs,
Great. Do we have one more question from inside the room?
Just wondering if conservation easements are playing into this whole picture. If they've entered the game.
Yes, oh, absolutely. Yeah, conservation easements, that's another, I didn't mention that as another way that a lot of grasslands have been protected or perpetually protected. So people, they know they want to keep their ranching grass and they can put parts of it under conservation easements. That's a huge important way that we can protect grasslands. Fish and Wildlife Service buys easements, the Lands Alliances buy easements, and there is a great emphasis toward doing them in native grasslands. Yeah, great point. I didn't even mention easements much.
I just wanted to give a plug for the Upper Missouri River Breaks National Monument too. That's a great area of high plains wilderness. You can float through there. I've made the mistake of backpacking through there. I don't know if anyone else has done that. And you experience the gumbo mud. And I think the gumbo is one of the things that's preserved that prairie ecosystem. So I wanted to thank the gumbo mud. Just don't try to hike through it when it's wet. Thanks, Pat.
Okay, well, thank you, Beth. Thank you all for attending tonight. Thank you to those people who joined us online. If you want to learn more about how we can protect grasslands and prairies, as Beth mentioned, we have a talk coming up 2 weeks from tomorrow. It's online only, and you can register for that at galtonvalleygrowthday.org.
That's going to be online, and you won't have a chance to meet the American Prairie people. There's a couple boxes up here with a newsletter and map from American Prairie that they brought by, so you can pick one up before you leave and have that.
Okay, and then finally, I want to make sure that you save the date for the Gallatin Valley Earth Day Festival. It's going to be Saturday, April 19th at the Gallatin Valley County Fairgrounds. We hope to see you all there. So thank you for coming. Thank you for watching online. And thank you, Beth, for a very interesting presentation. Good night and stay warm out there.